back to the Lincoln Project. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I'm once again joined by Tina Nguyen, resident MAGA expert and insider at Puck News, where she chronicles the transformation of the GOP and the egos and intrigues there within, in Trump world and beyond. Prior to her time at Puck, she wrote for Mediaite, Vanity Fair, Politico, The Daily Caller, Tina, and some other now either defunct or probably defunct outlets, which we'll get to. Her first book is out this week, everybody. Go get it. The MAGA Diaries, My Surreal Adventures Inside the Right Wing and How I Got Out, which is available wherever fine books are found. Today, she's coming to us live in studio from Washington, D.C. Tina, welcome back.
Thank you for having me back. I'm really excited to rock and roll again.
Amen. Well, all right. So listen, one thing I will say is that, you and I have I don't know how long we've actually known each other, a couple of years maybe. But the one thing that I said to you right before we started recording was you don't often find members of the mainstream media, as I put air quotes out here, who came from a more conservative political ideological space than I did. And I'm not particularly ideological anyway, and I'm not particularly conservative. So it was always interesting to talk to you, one, because you so innately and inherently understood what the Republican Party has become, but also because, look, I have some revulsion at my own party, but it doesn't stop me from looking at it objectively, if that makes sense, which is you can say I'm disappointed in what's become of my party. I'm disappointed I've become, what's become of people I used to know. But that doesn't mean I can't tell you exactly, A, why they do something, B, how they do it, where they do it, what they're doing it for, and say, okay, now that at least as a political, I don't even know what I am anymore, Tina. I don't think I'm a consultant anymore. I now understand how to beat them, right? And I used to use those tools to beat Democrats, and now I use those tools to beat people like Donald Trump. So tell us, how did you find your way to the world? And let's start figuring out how we got you out.
Man, oh man. Took me a while to figure out exactly how I got in or out. Like, that was the entire process of writing the memoir. But what I realized after years and years and years of thinking about this was that I entered the movement as someone who really was obsessed with the Founding Fathers, one, and wanted a career in journalism, two. And when you look at me, for listeners who cannot tell by my last name, I am an Asian American woman whose parents were refugees out of Vietnam, who grew up in Boston. And you're like, wait a second, how are you everything that you just said you are, but then also getting into the world of conservatism? And the two primary factors that drove me to the right to begin with, and this was circa 2008, 2009, Ron Paul time, was one, I did not have the privilege of a lot of the people I went to school with. I went to this really elite private school on scholarship, but around ninth grade, I started realizing, oh my God, there's an entire set of rules that they know to follow in order to get into Harvard or any of the Ivy Leagues. And like, this place was so elitist that anything that wasn't in the Northeast of that caliber was considered a loser institution. Like, people stopped talking to me when they discovered I got into Tulane. It was that bad.
Right. New Orleans is for Mardi Gras and Jazz Fest and nothing more.
Oh, yes, of course. But that was what my parents knew was successful because they were refugees. They had no idea what was important in America other than like education of a name brand level. Like at one point, I read about this in the book, my mother was disappointed I didn't get into Harvard, and so she started putting pressure on my younger sister to do so. And there was a really passive-aggressive note she left on my youngest sister's desk that was like, you have two options. Either you're going to, one, Harvard, Yale, or Stanford, she spelled it incorrectly, or two, community college.
Right.
And that was the dichotomy we sort of lived in. Right. And second, in my weird journey, I was a giant nerd about the American Revolution. Like, I grew up in Boston, literally down the road from John Adams's mansion Peacefield, living in history all the time. Even Milton was tied to the American Revolution and had founding members who ended up somehow related to like signers of the Constitution. So I learned about the revolution. I was obsessed with these ideals. And the moment that my boyfriend at the time was like, hey, I'm going to go to this one college in California that's obsessed with studying the founding fathers too. Also, they're giving me a lot of money. I'm like, wait a second. Could I have a career where I study the founding fathers for a living? That's pretty cool. I want to do that.
But that ends up being Claremont McKenna.
Oh my, absolutely, to a T.
And so Claremont McKenna it's sort of halfway between Los Angeles and California's vast inland desert, basically, right? And it's also got the Claremont Institute, which, from my perspective, Tina, and I'd love to get yours as someone who, I don't know if you spent any time at the Institute, but certainly went to college there, like could have been in Munich in like the early 1920s and 30s, right? Like this is a place that does not, when it talks about conservative thought, we're not talking about conservative Democrat, small d democratic thought. We're not talking about conservative small l liberalism. We're talking about a very distinct strain of conservatism bleeding into a really ugly, dark place. That's my opinion anyway.
So first of all, I do have to defend my graduation, my college institution. Claremont McKenna is its own separate entity. However, back in the founding times in like the 50s or something, there was a group of professors and intellectuals who kind of made their home at Claremont McKenna, called the West Coast Straussians, and they had a separate institution all the way out in, I think, Newport Beach that was officially the Claremont Institute. And there were students that went from Claremont McKenna, met these professors, dabbled in the research institutes like I did, and then the Claremont Institute was like, oh my God, come to our functions. We're going to have plaque tie galas, and you can apply for scholarships here, and we'll sit you in a really fancy hotel on the beach with like-minded individuals, and you will drink wine and discuss the virtues of civic society as written by St. Thomas Aquinas or something like that. And it's a very fancy form of nerdery, but, and I apologize to readers for going real deep cut conservatism here, but I think it's crucial to understand. The West Coast Straussians are the adherents of Leo Strauss, who was a philosopher in the 1940s and 50s, and his approach to studying philosophers themselves was that there is esoteric knowledge because in those texts that you can only understand if you are studying the era in which they operated in, the intellectual milieu of the time, and in cases where those thinkers would have been persecuted, being able to read between the lines and derive the meaning of what the guy was actually trying to say. And the East Coast Straussians kind of kept their study of these texts up to, I would like mostly the ancient Greeks, occasionally the Christian theologians, especially when it came to the topic of what exactly is good governance. How do you build a civic society that promotes virtue and cooperation, etc. And then the West Coast Straussians were like, what if you threw the founding fathers into the mix? Let's do it with them. And it's one thing to study the ancient Greeks and the Romans and the medieval philosophers because like they're hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But the founding fathers, their principles apply to like the present day. And the Claremont Institute's goal is the motto is literally preserving the ideas of the American founding, and they apply this strain of philosophical thought to the works of the founders, the constitutional documents, Lincoln, leading up through the modern day. And they have such a reverence for the founding fathers to the point that it's a little bit, and I apologize to the Claremontsters listening to this, a little circle jerky sometimes.
How could it not be? I mean, you're talking about a group of men, and you mentioned St. Thomas Aquinas or Plato or Socrates or Ludwig von Mises or Friedrich Hayek. Name your nerd, right? It's a very small subset of people talking about an even smaller subset of dead people, right? So how could it not become circular in some way?
Especially if the entire idea is only like you are smart enough to understand what they're actually saying. You belong in the club. No one else can get it, especially those people who want to be progressives and junk their ideas and move into the future.
This is an important thing that sort of you weave throughout. And again, as we were talking right before we started recording, is, I've spent now 4 years spending, with a lot of Democrats, right? Donors, activists, voters, you name it, right? There's and I remember when I taught a class at USC a million years ago, right? That there is a belief by many, many, many on the left that if you are a conservative, right, that you are a knuckle-dragging mouth breather. Now, I'm not saying that doesn't exist. But what I've tried to explain and what I will try to impart to our listeners here, as we see the movement that you were coming of age in and is now, frankly, darn near close to full flower and nearly in power again, Tina, is that, yes, Donald Trump might be crude and brutish and ugly and certainly not an intellectual, but you should never apply that to the people who have been working on this stuff. The kinds of things that those events you went to, those conversations you had, those people you knew, some of the people you're describing in this book that have been working on a definition of what they believe America should look like philosophically, morally, governmentally for 50 frickin' years. And you don't do that without a significant amount of thought. You don't do that without a significant amount of organization, without a significant amount of nose to the grindstone kind of work. And please understand, I'm not praising it. And also a significant amount of money, right? And so whenever someone on the left says they're a bunch of morons, I could say there are plenty of stupid people. Please understand, the people that Trump has surrounded himself with may be bad from my perspective. I'm talking from Reed's perspective, but do not underestimate their intelligence and their willingness to do whatever they think is necessary to eventually bring their world view into power in this country. Now, that's my perspective. I'd love to get your perspective. Obviously, you're my guest. So,
look, I think one of the things that also did help me was that I had tried to spend time covering progressives as well and Democrats. And there was a hot second at Vanity Fair where I sort of just don't have the bandwidth to cover the right, because I still feel a little bit emotionally attached and have weird hangups over the entire thing. But I went into covering progressives with the same idea that there was some amount of organization and some amount of infrastructure or coherent intellectual thought or community or like even a sense of community. And right. I did not find that at all. Like, nope. It was just a whole bunch of people who wanted to make the future happen immediately and break things while they did so. Like, but
not put the work in.
Not at all. I think this is the only book you'll ever read that has both like an original interview with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Tucker Carlson.
Right.
So, but I interviewed her in 2018 or so after she got elected. And she was talking to me about this pretty grand vision she had about how progressives were going to make their stance known in Congress. And she was always like, we can't negotiate because they want to drag us over here. We have to stay here and maybe go a little bit further. And I'm like, good luck, Congresswoman. And I was talking to another woman who was the chair of the Nebraska State Party at the time.
Yes, I was going to bring this up. Yeah.
She was telling me that there were people in Nebraska who probably would have been Democrats if there had been enough money to reach out to them. But the Democratic backbench had been so hollowed out over the past 8 or so years. There hadn't been enough people trying to identify good candidates for local office, much less state office or governors. not even Congress. And she was like, yeah, like, I only got $30,000 this year to operate. And I'm like, are you serious? That's it? And like, I don't know. She just seemed to be operating in this little island. And I figured there would probably be like some network of activists or someone she could call on to, swoop in and help her out occasionally the same way that the conservatives did. But like, she lacked that. And all of the money from these progressive donors were going to their own things, like the shiny objects, as she called it.